All right, we need to talk about something that happened in Baghdad back in March of 2012. It's a difficult story, but it's an important one. We're going to look at a brutal campaign that sits at this tragic crossroads of cultural misunderstanding, religious extremism, and, frankly, the systemic failure to protect a vulnerable group of kids in post-invasion Iraq. So, let's just lay out the brutal facts here. We're talking about March 2012, teenagers in Baghdad, kids who just adopted the emo style, were systematically targeted. They were kidnapped, they were tortured, and they were murdered. The weapon of choice? Horrifically, it was often cement blocks, and the people behind it were paramilitary groups. The reason for all this? They saw this style as a rejection of their values, as some kind of dangerous Western influence, and they made a deadly assumption that emo meant gay. So, just how many people were actually killed? Well, this is where things get really murky. The official story and the reports coming from the ground, they tell two completely different tales. And that difference reveals a hidden and much darker truth. Okay, so the official number from the government, the one they reported to the world, just 6 deaths. That's it. It's a number that sounds contained, like a small, isolated incident. But reports from hospitals, from security sources, from human rights groups on the ground, they painted a totally different picture. They estimated the death toll was way, way higher, possibly up to 70 people. That huge gap between 6 and 70 tells you that this crisis was being actively downplayed. What's absolutely terrifying is how these killings were done. The method was so specific, so brutal, that it actually got its own name, Mot al-Blaka, which translates to death by blocking. You know, this wasn't just random violence. It was ritualistic. It was designed to send a message of terror. And listen to this account from a survivor. It just paints this horrific picture of systematic cruelty. It was a slow, agonizing death, which really just underscores the absolute hatred that was driving these attacks. So here's the crucial point. This wave of violence didn't just spring up out of nowhere. It came right after a very public condemnation from an official source, one that pretty much acted as a green light for what happened next. Right before the murder started in February 2012, this statement goes up on the Interior Ministry's own website, and the language is just chilling. They're given approval to eliminate the emo phenomenon. It officially brands a youth subculture as a danger to the entire society. And what happens next is predictable. Almost immediately after that official statement, these flyers start showing up all over Baghdad neighborhoods. The connection is undeniable, right? The government points to a target, and armed groups on the street are more than ready to act. But you gotta ask, why emos? Why this specific group of teenagers? Well, it all boiled down to a fundamental and, as it turns out, a lethal misunderstanding of what this subculture was even about. I mean, look at this. In the West, emo was mostly associated with alternative music, a certain fashion style, teenage angst, stuff like that. But for the perpetrators in Iraq, it meant something completely different. They saw it as this toxic mix of Satanism, corrupting Western culture, and, this is the critical part, as a clear sign of homosexuality. Now, to really understand how something like this could even happen, we have to zoom out a little. These killings in 2012 weren't just a random event. They were actually the horrifying peak of a much longer, tragic trend of LGBTQ persecution that really ramped up after the 2003 invasion. This timeline shows it so clearly. Before 2003, there was a fair amount of freedom. But after the invasion, you see the rise of these conservative religious parties and militias, and with them, a new wave of violent persecution. It created the perfect storm, the fertile ground for the massacres in 2012. So who was actually responsible? Well, human rights groups pointed their fingers at paramilitary groups like the Mahdi Army. But here's the really disturbing part. Witnesses reported that official Iraqi security forces were sometimes involved, either by helping or even by joining in on the killings. And while the cleric Muqtada al-Sadr denied his group was involved, he also called the teens unnatural, which certainly didn't help calm things down. So, after the killings, what was the official response? Pretty much complete denial. And this created this terrifying gap between what the government was saying and the reality for people who were still being hunted on the streets. You can see these two parallel realities right here. The government was out there saying the whole story was made up and promising to protect young people.
Meanwhile, a BBC investigation and reports from the ground found that the violence was still going on, and victims were directly blaming the Interior Ministry for starting the whole thing.
The international outcry over this did eventually lead to a few real, if delayed, changes. The Netherlands, for instance, expanded its asylum policy for LGBTQ Iraqis. And then, a year later, an Iraqi committee actually came out and said that LGBTQ people are no different from others, and set up a charter to protect them. It's a small step, but a pretty significant change in official language.
And that leaves us with this one big, profound question. The emo killings weren't just about fashion or music. They were about what happens to a society that's been pushed to its absolute breaking point by decades of conflict. When everything feels like it's falling apart, the fear of anyone who is different can become deadly. It forces us to ask, what does this tragedy show us about the dark potential for intolerance that exists in any society fractured by war?